70% of the variance explained is sort of in that first step in the change from spring to autumn. We can do that also for the fall. So here we're expressing how many birds are returning in the spring. So you see it's about 65, 70% of the birds are returning. The rest are from the population due to mortality. How much of that sort of demographic index explains the year-to-year transition in numbers of birds? And there we see that it's only 16%, so much lower. And the reason is that sort of, if you have, say, for a given year, 30% more birds migrating south, typically we also see about 30% more birds coming back in the spring. And that sort of rate doesn't change as much as we see in the spring. So sort of on a very high level, sort of an avifauna level of migratory birds, we can see that it's really the summer transition, or the summer half year that really makes or breaks population trends, or what can really cause a huge uptick or a huge downtick. And thinking back about our bathtub, it's really sort of at the tap level, sort of where we are starting to see what causes these annual fluctuations. That's not to say, of course, that the top cannot influence the tap. I mean, there's lots of literature about seasonal interactions, carryover effects that are important, and how the sort of non-breeding seasons affects the non-breeding seasons. But sort of the demographic consequences are really show themselves in the summer half year on average. Now I want to take one step back and think about what was really key in this analysis, and I think what made this possible is that we start to estimate the total population size, in this case the population size of all migratory birds flying over the US, multiple times throughout the annual cycle. That we measure this population size multiple times, that's what makes these sort of analysis feasible, where we start to think to break or partition things in summer and winter half year. And that's not something we have been able to do very often so far, and especially not for single species. Usually you lose them out of your study area once they are starting on migration, and it's hard to track population sizes throughout the year. And I think also here, and here I transition in my talk a little bit more as a sort of looking towards the future. I think here things also on the species level are starting to change. And that's very much driven, I think, by citizen science programs like eBird. And from the right of the start, I want to give a big shout out here to Daniel Fink, who is also a researcher at the Cornell Lab. This is very much his life work, and I think it's amazing what he has accomplished here, as well as the rest of the eBird Status and Trends team at the lab. It's a very big effort that many people are involved with, and most of you have probably seen these dynamic eBird distribution maps before. And I think one of the key aspects here is that we start to measure populations and distributions of populations throughout the annual cycle. And here I've sort of made 3 snapshots. And I think a very important result that Daniel showed this year is when we look at population changes over different years. And here we have done that for the breeding season, and you see that the fluctuations that we see in eBird data, the population, is sort of relatively subtle variations in population size from year to year, as we get those from the eBird models. If you overlay them with the BBS trends, which are still the golden standard, I think, for looking at these population trends, you see there's this very close correspondence. And I think this is really key, because apparently these citizen science data sets have the ability to pick up population fluctuations like this and population trends. And even maybe more surprisingly, or oh, my talk is stuck. We can also do that in a non-breeding season. So here, these are eBird data collected only in a non-breeding season, and we see the same sort of fluctuations and patterns of change measured in a totally different region. So yeah, and the fact that we can do it in two different places also leads us to think that potentially it's also possible, therefore, to look at population change within the year. But essentially, these patterns of reproduction and mortality do. They are gradual population changes during the year. So in an ideal world, that would look something like this, right? We would integrate the population size over the full area of the distribution map as estimated in these STEM models. And in an ideal world, you see a gradual mortality during the non-breeding season, going up, a peak in reproduction and due to breeding, followed by fairly steep mortality of juveniles, and another gradual mortality during migration and non-breeding periods. What we could potentially do is sort of take different snapshots along this curve of population change. We have pre-breeding estimates of population size and post-breeding estimates of population size. And again, it's very similar to what we did in the radar analysis, come up with these approximate measures of recruitment as well as survival. Now we know already that our ideal world is unfortunately not like this, and these curves look typically quite a bit more complex. For example, it's quite common for it to see a summer dip in detectability for many species when they're nesting or molting, and individuals get very shy and they're simply not as observed as much by. And therefore, I think to make this work, we really have to think about, okay, which periods of the year are we going to sample? When are we having a good detectability? And really also try to think of these ratios in post-breeding and post-breeding as not absolute measures of recruitment, but more indices of recruitment that are affected by detectability. And thinking about to the future, for example, the blackpoll warbler, one of our steep decliners, a very good moment actually to sample these populations is actually during migration, when most of these birds are moving through our very dense network of eBird observers, and when they're not on the wintering ground where they're observed much less. And you start to see like sort of types of analyses that are maybe very similar to what I've just shown you for the radar data, where we sample these populations during spring and autumn migration. So as a lookout towards these macrodynamic indices, I think there's already clear, there's multiple caveats. They will be affected by seasonal changes in the detectability. And most likely that it's just the quality of the data will force us to make sort of unconventional partitionings of the annual cycle. For example, measuring population sizes actually during mid-migration periods, something that you would maybe not do if you would design your very careful demographic study. And really that will force us to focus really on relative index changes from year to year, because the absolute values of these demographic indices will be affected by changes in detectability. That said, there's also huge potential. These indices are potentially representative of large spatial areas, and we can look at other large-scale environmental effects on vital rates like droughts, fall springs, heat waves, things that are typically also fairly large scale. And there's an advantage, I think, in having measures that sort of match these different scales. There is the potentially that we can generalize to many, many species, and as such really help and complement these existing demographic data sets and really fill this gap that we have in demographic information. That's sort of why we're trying to work on this. So very much to do, very much early stage. This hopes, I think, gives an idea of the direction that we're thinking. I want to acknowledge the Migratory project team, Ellie, Frank, Ken, and Jacob Sokkeler, who will join us next spring, as well as the eBird status and trends and broadcast teams, which are really important for the success of this project. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
That was awesome, Adrian. Thanks so much. That's incredible. Let's do a couple questions, even though we're because we have time this morning, I think, for that. So let's, Anna, do we have any questions in the Q&A that, that Adrian could take at this point?
Yeah, we do. Thanks. That was a really cool talk, Adrian. Ellen Ketterson has a question that I was also wondering about. Do you have a reason for why eBird estimates are a little bit higher than the BBS estimates, kind of across the whole span of the graph?
You mean especially in the winter in the non-breeding area, right? Yeah, I think that's something we have been puzzling about, and the honest answer is that no, we don't really. There seem to be sometimes these offsets in that the pattern over time is the same, but in absolute terms, the magnitudes of the change are actually not the same. And so no, I don't have a good answer to that, but yeah, I think there's a lot that can go on, right? And a lot revolves about these differences in detectability throughout the year that have the potential to change potentially these things. So, but yeah, that's important, and that's also, I think, if we want to use these sort of macro scale demographic indices, we maybe have to step away a little bit from this idea of having a true mortality estimate. I think the information that I hope that we'll get out is maybe much more in sort of the year-to-year change in mortality estimates that we will get, and you will have maybe years with high and low mortality, while the absolute value is maybe not directly interpretable as a true mortality rate. So that will force us to think a bit differently about these type of indices if this is going to work out. Yeah.
Thanks. You're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A, so maybe if you have a chance, you can answer some of them after in writing, but I'll ask at least one more. So this is an interesting question. Do you have an impression of how species like Blackpoll warbler, which migrate over the ocean in fall but over land in spring, might skew comparisons of autumn totals versus spring totals across large species assemblages? Or do the transects extend over the ocean for some distance?
Yeah, so that's key. That of course these routes of these birds are different in the spring and in the fall, and therefore, again, that is one of these other biases that in typically in the case of the Blackpoll warbler, I could imagine that in the spring it moves a little bit more centrally through the US, and we have a little bit better sample of it. It moves better through our observation network than it does maybe in the fall, when a lot of birds are already taking off quite a bit more north from where we have a lot of observers. So that is true, and in that sense, our estimates might be affected by that. But I think at the same time, that doesn't mean that we cannot give a sensible that for these periods, the migration in the routes from year to year will be similar, and we can hope that we still get a good index of population size again in the spring and in the fall, and that these ratios therefore spring and fall will be meaningful in the sense of capturing differences from year to year. That said, it's not a guarantee. This is a work in progress, and I could very well see that for certain species, the sort of the core question is: are these differences in detectability that we have, and the differences in how things move through our detection networks of the observers? Is that variation now smaller or larger than the true demographic signals that we are after? And that's what we'll have to show. Yeah, and my hope is that these demographic signals will actually be larger, and that the seasonal variation in detectabilities will be relatively constant from year to year. But there's no guarantee.
Thanks, Adrian. We should move on. Again, I'd like to remind all panelists that the questions and answers, the Q&A tool is available, and please feel free to answer questions. But after you answer a question by typing, please don't dismiss the question, so that we have a complete record of all the questions and their answers that we can provide to attendees at a future time. So at this point, our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Wayne Thogmartin. Wayne is a quantitative ecologist with the USGS, working at the at the Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Wayne's main focus is trying to understand the intersection of animal ecology, spatial and temporal analyses, and statistics. And Wayne's going to talk about migratory connectivity, identifying priority places and pathways through network analysis. Thanks, Wayne.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone. So as Tom mentioned, I'd like to describe some approaches for identifying priority places and pathways for migratory populations using network approaches. Juliet Lamb set me up quite well for this if you took her talk in on Tuesday. So, but before I get too far into this, I'd like to be sure to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators for this project. Jay Diffendorfer and Brady Mattson were co-leads with me in forming a National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis working group on the habitat for migratory species that helped foster much of the developments that I'll show today. Christine Sample and Joanna Beery were very important in the mathematical underpinnings of the models, and Darius Simmons is critical in the ecosystem services side of things. So as Juliet mentioned Tuesday in her description of network models, a population spatial structure can be modeled as a weighted and directed network where nodes represent habitats. The nodes, let's see if I can get my cursor to work. Here we go. Where nodes represent habitats, and then the edges between them represent migratory pathways. These nodes and edges have weights that describe the reproduction and survival rates of a node or pathway, and the migratory probabilities between nodes. So typically, when we think about networks, we might have in our minds a metapopulation network. So, like I have here on the left, I have a Pulliam metapopulation network diagram where we have a source population where births exceed deaths, as well as a sink population where births are less below deaths or less than deaths. And on an annual time step, immigration connects these two. This differs from a migratory network where we have within season movement or within year movement. So in this case, we have movement that for this migratory network on the right, we might have movement, say, from wintering node B, where the individuals move to breeding node X, and then in subsequent fall, progress back down to the wintering node A. And so as this table here on the right suggests, all of these connections occur across the annual life cycle of the species. And so we have to keep track of that and understand and accommodate that when we want to make sense of these migratory networks. So the way we've approached this is through these discrete time population or matrix population models, which should have a very similar, should evoke some, well, anyways, basically what I'd like to say is that the population size in the following season is this function of the population size in the current season modified by this A matrix here. And this population size is a combination of the populations across the nodes, across the seasons. So it's a time and place specific number of individuals. And we can further delineate those individuals by the age and sex classes in which they occur. So we modify this population size vector with an A matrix that contains both place and time specific demography and movement. So it's just comprised of these two matrix components. So once we have that in place, the next step is that we want to use that to help predict which habitats and pathways are most critical to the short-term population growth under environmental change. And so what we do in that to characterize that, or to calculate that, is to create this G matrix, or this G metric that we've devised. It's basically the absolute value difference between the overall network growth rate and a growth rate that is measured when we've perturbed the network by some amount. And so, you know, we can perturb nodes and paths. We can enhance them, we can degrade them, or we can remove them altogether from the network, and then evaluate what the consequence is to this G metric. So this is an alternative approach to some other previously published metrics, like the metapopulation metrics of Ovascanin and Hansky, as well as sensitivity analyses. But the important point that these other metrics don't accommodate is that they don't recognize that seasonal movement among locations and across different network connections. So how do we calculate the G metric? I'm going to have to move Tom out of the way here. Whoops, sorry. So basically, we have these. The important point is that we have time series in winter and in summer, and we have to reconcile across those time series. They're not coincident with one another, and that's really the difficult problem that we're facing. So basically, what we do is we have this rate of change between the populations within their networks, and we modify that or kind of send that through this A matrix that controls for demography and movement, place-specific demography and time-specific demography and movement. And so then, so that helps us create this annual growth rate. And then to evaluate the growth rate when it's perturbed, all we do is insert this disturbance parameter here. And I'll show you the consequences of that with a case study. So, you know, waterfowl are a success story. And so it would be useful, I think, for us to focus a bit on why waterfowl, as opposed to other species, are a success story. You know, we see from Ken's work that birds in wetland environments are doing well. In fact, the waterfowl are doing well. Unfortunately, one species among the waterfowl is not doing well. It's the northern pintail. It's exhibited a very long-term decline in abundance, well below population goals set for the species. And so, I mentioned very briefly earlier in the week why that might be, but we can follow up on that. So how do we approach, or how do we employ these network approaches to understanding the dynamics of pintails? So Brady Madsen led a paper in 2002 that describes a network model for this species. It's a full annual cycle model. It's sex and age structured, and it has very important aspects relating to density dependence. It's a fairly simple network. It's got 3 breeding nodes, one in Alaska, one in the prairie potholes, the duck factory of North America. And then there's this sort of nebulously defined unsurveyed area north of the prairie potholes. There's also 2 wintering locations, one in California and one in the Gulf Coast. These are not explicitly defined. You know, they're kind of, I guess, spatially implicit, if you will. But we have network connections among all these different nodes for describing the fall migration as well as the spring migration. So if we depict this in a more cartoon kind of graph arrangement, we have this representation here. So you can see that we have our breeding nodes that are connected to each of our wintering nodes through fall migration. We have our wintering nodes that are connected to our breeding nodes through spring migration. And then we have this important flyover aspect. So in some years, the prairie potholes are insufficient for the birds that may want to nest there. And so individuals fly over into this northern unsurveyed area, or they move on to Alaska to breed. And so these sorts of dynamics can be incorporated in these network models, and we can evaluate their implications. So what does it mean for G? I'm going to get rid of Tom altogether here because he's in my way. So basically, when we calculate G for a seasonal an annual average G for our network model, we get this sort of diagram, if you will, basically demonstrating that the important paths in the important locations are defined here. So we have, the prairie potholes are obviously very important, but even more important and perhaps surprising was the importance of the overwinter location in California. And we also have measures of the criticality for both the spring migration as well as the fall migration here in these tables. And I've tried to kind of just describe them with the line widths here. But basically what this approach tells us is that like loss of the prairie potholes, if we were to remove it altogether, we would reduce the network growth, the population growth rate by 70% by removal of the entirety of the prairie potholes. Similarly, if we were to remove the connections between Alaska and California, we would reduce the network growth rate by 35 to 38%, depending upon whether we're going north or going south. But it's unlikely at such a large geographic scale for us to be able to remove nodes of such size. So really what we would like to understand is the consequences of perturbations, small perturbations that may occur either through habitat enhancement or through environmental change or habitat loss. And so what we've done here is we've plotted the G calculations as with the magnitude of perturbation here on the x-axis and the magnitude of the consequence on the y-axis. And you can see that the relationships are not necessarily linear, that as you magnify, or as the size, the magnitude of the perturbation increases, the consequences to the network are not necessarily linearly related. And so it depends upon how much change has occurred. You have to keep in mind how much change has occurred, because that changes the network arrangement and network operation. So in one example, for instance, the consequences in California are lower than those in comparison to the prairie potholes until you get to complete loss. So this is prairie potholes. This is California, and so they are not. The losses in those areas are not equivalent until you get up to about complete removal from the network. Some of these changes are not necessarily intuitive. So like a 50% enhancement in the northern unsurveyed area, the area north of the prairie potholes, would lead to about a 15%, increase, or would offset a 15% decrease in the prairie potholes. So you can imagine climate change operating such that the northern portions of Canada are improving for waterfowl, whereas the prairie potholes might be diminishing. And it's that trade-off, is the north growing in quality for waterfowl at a greater rate than the historical areas of occurrence degrading. And so we can evaluate those consequences through this kind of modeling approach. So what sort of data are needed for this kind of arrangement? We've talked at length this week about network models. And so here's an example for golden wing warblers. We've got two patches in the breeding region, and they might be connected connecting to 2 patches in the wintering locations. So you need to kind of have some sense of the network structure of the species and how they're connected, how those patches are connected. You also need to have some sort of understanding of the node magnitude. What are the relative population sizes of these different locations? And then ideally, you'd have some information about node and path-specific demography. You know, if these are equivalent patches as far as their vital rates are concerned, then they're in large measure the same patch. So heterogeneity in node and path-specific demography is kind of critical for the operation of these network models. One thing that we haven't talked about, and one thing that's important to me is that, you know, just because we've identified the limitations in a species, you know, the limitations to its demography, you know, it may not be that we have the ability to address those limitations, or at least not efficiently and effectively. So this notion that Nichols and Hines introduced back in 2002 is an important one, I think, to keep in mind. So, you know, we've spent quite a bit of time this week talking about the sensitivity of lambda to changes in vital rates, but we also need to understand that there's a sensitivity of those vital rates to management action, and then there's a sensitivity of those management actions to cost. And so in the end, we're really kind of working across this whole calculation of the change in lambda as a function of some change in dollars. And we need to keep that calculation in mind. We've tried to keep that calculation in mind when thinking about flows across these networks, the flow of ecosystem services and funding. The motivation for our approach, our adoption of these network approaches is really, we wanted to know how value is generated in one location and is moved by migrational processes to other locations. So you know, ducks are hatched in the prairie potholes in Alaska and then move to California and the Gulf Coast, where they're acquired by hunters. So that movement is generated in one location and moves by migration to other locations. Similarly, we've tried to understand how funding flows from one location from one state or one location in the nation to areas where we need to direct that for habitat management. And so we've spent quite a bit of time identifying these different sources of funds and how they flow into and support waterfowl and duck management in North America. There's some interesting cross-border transboundary governance issues that need to be wrestled with as well when you think about these sorts of flows of ecosystem services and funding. And this is my last slide, but what I'd like to do is end that we, you know, like I said, we want to focus on areas where we think we can get the best bang for our buck. And so, you know, we've thought about a lot about population trajectories and how to evaluate or simulate improvements in one node versus another. So we might increase the amount of grass or grass connectivity in the prairie potholes, or we might want to restore wetlands down in the Gulf Coast. And so, you know, how do we evaluate that? Well, we've done some, you know, typical simulation models where we evaluate the consequences of these different scenarios, and we can recover northern pintails or return them to their population goal if we amend the habitat. But the G statistic tells us that operating in the prairie potholes is 3 times more effective than operating in the Gulf Coast. So we have to keep that in mind, that our better lever might be up here. It just sort of depends in the end about whether or not we can deliver effectively at such large scales. So that's all I have for today. And so if there's any time for questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Well, thanks, Wayne. I guess it's fair to say that you're a gee whiz kid.
Haha.
Couldn't resist. Um, I think we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions at the most. Anna, do you have something on cue?
Yes, we do. Yeah, that was a really cool presentation, Wayne. We have a question from Todd Fear who asks, is it feasible or useful for a network model to incorporate within season nodes representing changes in habitat use as birds fledge young or move into different habitats with them before migration, or is within season movement and habitat change adequately captured within the breeding season nodes?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a totally adequate answer. You know, we took a network approach because, you know, we often use that as a shorthand way of thinking about how to arrange species over such large scales. But if you need that finer level understanding, maybe networks might not be the best approach. I'm not sure. One of the other efforts I've been involved in is development of this continental scale movement and energetics based model that moves ducks kind of continuously across the continent rather than through a network. And so we have tried to think about ways of moving from networks to a more continuous arrangement that might accommodate that finer level movement dynamics that Todd's asking about. You know, our working group talked about it in terms of partial differential equations and that sort of thing, and it gets really, really hairy. So I think there's definitely room for novel developments there, but I don't think we've entirely satisfied that.
Let's move on, and we'll come back to more questions during the panel time. I want to be responsible in giving everybody a shot at this. This has just been fascinating to listen to these 2 different perspectives, both way outside my wheelhouse. Our next speaker, Mitch Wegman, is an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, and his interest is in understanding how individual and population processes explain variation in avian ecology. And we'll talk a little bit about, you know, alluding back to one of the points made at the very beginning when we learned about the the Icarus network, that the capacity to really incorporate behavioral information is, in addition to just simply tracking, is really advancing our horizons in understanding dynamics of populations. Mitch will talk about prioritizing conservation investments based on joint use of both movement and behavior data from migrating birds. Mitch?
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone. And thanks very much to the organizers for this amazing workshop. This is really neat. And I'm glad we can do this despite the challenges right now from a World Health perspective. So this is really cool. I'm really excited to talk about some of the work we've been doing with GPS and acceleration data on larger migratory birds, but in the waterfowl vein that Wayne was just referencing. So, you know, we often hear about the full annual cycle as this really important sequence of seasons to study bird migration. For decades, of course, folks studied the breeding ecology of migratory birds, and for good reason. Wayne just highlighted that investments in the prairies where pintails breed are a wise use of conservation dollars relative to wintering use of resources. And still yet, of course, we know that events in spring and events in winter hugely influence what happens in summer. And we know that these carryover effects are manifested in different ways on survival and on productivity. For relatively long-lived birds that have the capacity to make annual decisions about whether to attempt reproduction or not, it becomes very interesting then to study why some are choosing to go for reproduction and some are choosing to defer. So we have a prediction here. If birds are preparing to breed well in advance, and conversely some aren't, then we'd expect to see a signal of these decisions. So we're really trying to get at this idea of deferral or attempt failure, so as to know where to invest limited conservation resources. So for this talk, I'm going to describe a study system of greater white-fronted geese. And in the spirit of this amazing work on the loss of bird populations, despite waterfowl populations doing quite well, there are some unique cases like pintails, like Greenland white-fronted geese, this bird in the photo, that actually are bucking the waterfowl trend. They're declining. So here we're discovering fundamental environment, behavior, productivity relationships in greater white-fronted geese from a global perspective. So these birds increased from the 1980s to about 2000, and then have decreased since to present day. And so we're really puzzled by this. This is a concerning trend, and one that, as I mentioned, is a mismatch from other waterfowl populations. So we have a sequence of fundamental questions about these birds in this population decline. One is, at what point during spring migration are decisions about behavioral time allocation different between successful breeding and unsuccessful breeding birds, or those that defer? A second question is, how much do weather conditions mediate behavior and mask the effects of variation in preparation for breeding? And a third one is, to what extent can rich behavioral data provide new perspective on habitat use to better inform targeted conservation efforts in space and time? So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these questions. So I mentioned the recent Greenland white-fronted goose population decline and how that has been puzzling for us. In a series of previous projects, we showed that the recruitment rate of these Greenland white-fronted geese has actually declined even during the period of population increase. And it's declined over the entire sequence of years in which these birds have been studied. So this is the approximate demographic mechanism for population change in these geese. But the demographic side of things doesn't really allow us to get at deferral or attempt and failure. And so for this, we chose to study two populations of greater white-fronted geese, the declining Greenland population and an increasing mid-continent white-fronted goose population, the birds that we see in the mid-continent of North America, which have increased over the entire time series that we're studying the Greenland birds. This work was led by a former master's student of mine, Stephanie Cunningham. She finished about 1.5 years ago. And we used tracking device data, which I'll talk about in detail in a minute, for both populations. So we had about 26 individuals that we had full tracks for on the Greenland side. These Greenland white-fronted geese breed in West Greenland. They stage in Iceland, and they winter in Ireland and Scotland. And so they have a relatively risky migration strategy in which they cross the North Atlantic twice each migration. Whereas the mid-continent white-fronted geese breed in the Canadian Arctic and in Alaska, they stage throughout the mid-continent of North America, and they winter in the southern US. So they have this overland migration. And remember, there are these two very different population trajectories. So even though this is a small sample size, and I'll interpret our results cautiously, we really have this cool mixture of strategies developing in these populations. So I mentioned movement and behavior using tracking devices. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about these units in detail. We have a duty cycle that's quite frequent. So we're collecting one GPS fix every 30 minutes and an acceleration or ACC fix every 6 minutes. The data are uploaded daily via the global mobile phone network. So basically we buy a cell phone plan for each goose, and they check in daily when they're within a mobile coverage area. We can use the acceleration data to work out behaviors every 6 minutes for multiple years. We can do this because we put the same exact tracking device, this is a neck collar tracking device, on a captive bird. We film it for tens of hours. We know exactly when the ACC fix is occurring on the bird. We of course know the behavior from the film, so we can link then behaviors with acceleration patterns to work out, say, what feeding looks like, stationary behavior, And then we use wild birds to work out what flight looks like. So we developed this library of known behaviors paired with acceleration patterns. And then we use these machine learning algorithms, neural networks, classification, regression trees, and so forth to develop a training data set and then classify millions of fixes of wild bird behavior. A lot of this work is contingent on our ability to work out reproductive success. So we infer this via the GPS and the acceleration data. Here on the y-axis, we have energy expenditure during, and on the x-axis, the summer period, the incubation window for these geese. So we would anticipate a pretty substantial drop in energy expenditure measured from ACC data during the incubation window because the female is sitting on the nest. And so we see this pretty marked drop over the full term incubation. When comparing to an individual that doesn't have this drop and inferred defer, we see no change in energy expenditure throughout the entire summer period. So a lot of motoring about on molting lakes and in summer breeding or summering areas, non-breeding areas in that case. Again, we have small sample sizes here, but just to illustrate that we do have a mixture of Greenland and mid-continent stories here for both breeding attempts and breeding deferrals. So we have a series of questions here that we want to work out. One is, does time feeding prior to the breeding season predict decisions to defer or attempt reproduction? And for this, we're using the ecological memory framework. The fundamental idea here is a test of whether previous states influence past or future responses. Kiona Ogle at Northern Arizona University and others in 2015 published this really cool paper parameterizing an ecological memory model via the stochastic antecedent modeling framework. And basically this modeling framework works as a regression, modified regression, with an antecedent variable, which is calculated from summed daily values and weights. So this is a hypothetical example just to illustrate the patterns coming out of these sorts of stochastic antecedent models. So on the y-axis, we have proportion of time feeding, which can be measured from the acceleration data. Also, we have weights. On the x-axis, we have day of migration. So this is just from wintering areas to breeding areas. The solid black line, the pattern you're looking at is the proportion of time feeding. And we see this pretty substantial drop early on in migration. The orange bar, or sorry, the purple bars represent the various weights associated with the cumulative importance of each day. And so while there's this pretty substantial drop in the proportion of time feeding, early in the migration period, the weights would suggest in this instance that actually those moments are not as important as those leading up to the breeding window. So even though there's less variation closer to the breeding period, the importance of that variation is greater. So this is what this framework allows us to do. So we have a prediction here with this framework, and that is that attempting geese will show increased feeding behavior compared to deferring reproduction. So on the y-axis there, we have the antecedent proportion of time feeding variable. Here are some results. So this is a Bayesian analysis. So each of these different effects is represented by a violin. And the violin, where I'm showing here with my cursor, is an entire posterior distribution illustrated. The points are the means, the posterior means, and then a 95% credible interval is the bar. And so there are some year effects for 2012 and 2013 relative to 2018, but really we're interested in this proportion of time feeding effect, which is negative for the Greenland birds. If we look at the mid-continent birds, we also see a negative relationship in the proportion of time feeding and a positive relationship of 2017 relative to 2018. So we have some cool patterns developing here in the effect of proportion of time feeding on breeding, the probability of a breeding attempt. Now on the weights. So here we have the weights estimated for the Greenland birds and the mid-continent birds. So this allows us to work out this cumulative importance of these days. Two messages here. One is that for both the Greenland and the mid-continent birds, we don't see any difference in the weight throughout migration. So for both populations, we're looking at from wintering to breeding areas. So no day is any more important than any other day, which is quite amazing. The second component here is that the Greenland population, the weights are consistently greater than the mid-continent population. This could be because there are fewer days of migration for the Greenland birds, or because the Greenland days are more important, genuinely speaking, from an ecological perspective, given that those birds, remember, fly over the North Atlantic twice en route from wintering to breeding areas. So that's something we're evaluating further. A second question, do weather effects on feeding behavior, change within the migration period? So for this, we used a different modeling approach. We used the dynamic linear models. These allow both the ecological response and the environmental effects to vary with time. So we can harness the data at the interval at which the data are collected, which is quite a robust way for estimation. So importantly here, we're looking at temporal variation in great detail in ecological processes. We had several hypotheses related to how weather might explain variation in proportionate time feeding. We predicted that precipitation rate would be negatively related to the proportionate time feeding, so more rain, less feeding time, and that minimum temperature would be positively related to goose proportionate time feeding. We also hypothesized that the effect sizes for both precipitation rate and temperature would be greater later in migration, because we thought the importance of these features is greater as you get closer and closer to the actual incubation window, and that the effect sizes would be greater for Greenland birds. We predicted this again because of the more risky Greenland strategy relative to the mid-continent white-fronted goose strategy. So here is one panel of results. This is the effective precipitation rate on the proportionate time feeding in Greenland birds. So it's quite a busy panel, but I'll start on the left side. So on the left y-axis, we're looking at individual bird IDs. So each number there is an individual bird. We've grouped these individuals according to whether they deferred or attempted reproduction. So that's the right y-axis. And the colors here represent the strength of the effect. This is, again, precipitation rate on the proportionate time feeding. The stronger the red color, the more negative the relationship. The stronger the blue color, the more positive the relationship, and the white is sort of no effect or a neutral effect. So really here, from the wintering period on the left to the breeding period on the right, we just see lots of variation. There's no common strategy among deferrers or attempters. We also modeled this relationship with temperature and repeated for the mid-continent birds for a full comparison. So I'd like to present a couple conclusions here. In terms of evaluating our first question, how proportionate time feeding might explain variation in the probability of reproduction, we showed that there's some substantial evidence that variation in the proportionate time feeding can be linked with the probability of attempted breeding. However, we need to quantify the food quality to understand the contributions more deeply. So you might remember those were negative relationships. So less time feeding, higher probability of breeding. And so, of course, it seems reasonable that these birds, the fittest birds, the ones that are going to attempt reproduction, are selecting the most nutrient-rich food sources, which would require less time feeding. So that's the next step in this analysis. In terms of our second question, we showed that the precipitation rate and temperature can strongly influence behavior. That's what we predicted would happen. And in this case, then, these features, these environmental variables, can mask the effect of variation in preparation to attempt or defer. So we need to be quite careful in linking strictly behavior with the reproductive outcome, acknowledging that, of course, the weather conditions hugely influence what the birds actually do every 6 minutes that we're collecting the acceleration data. I mentioned one more fundamental question earlier, and that is, to what extent can rich behavioral data provide new perspective on habitat use to better inform conservation investments in space and time? So I'd like to show you a video here. This is a primary wintering area for Greenland white-fronted geese in Southeast Ireland. Each of these individual black points is a bird. The sort of center where these birds are congregating is Wexford Harbor, a bay that these birds roost in at night. And then they're going to these different fields, these different green polygons to feed. And so with both GPS and acceleration data, we now can work out, of course, where the animals are in the landscape, sort of an age-old question, but also how the animals are using the landscape. This is a predictive model that happens to link individuals when they behave similarly. So in terms of social structure, when these individuals are making repeated similar moves, the model is linking these as a unified effort. So I'd like to dig in a little bit more here and show you how we're using both GPS and ACC data for understanding habitat use. This work was led by Torrin Schaefer, who was a PhD student at Mizzou, advised by Chris Weichel. She recently graduated and is a postdoc now at Cornell. So Torrin was using the different classified behaviors, feeding, flying, stationary behavior, to work out how the types of habitats that these birds are in can be influenced by the behavior. And so here we're looking at a plot with the feeding classification on the right y-axis. The left y-axis is all the different behaviors, or sorry, the different habitats that these birds are using. And so we can see that dependent on the habitat, the transitions, the probability of the transitions changes from the feeding to flight, either remaining feeding or going to stationary behavior. So the functional use of these different habitats is quite different depending on the behavior that the bird is currently in. So the utility of pairing the location data to work out habitat and acceleration data to work out the behaviors is terrific. We now can directly estimate how animals are using landscapes and the connectivity among habitats. In doing this, then, we can ascribe greater importance to habitats that we know benefit animals based on specific behaviors. So, for example, feeding. So I have a couple key messages here. One is, in terms of conceptual advances, we are discovering how behavioral time allocation and movements among habitats affect subsequent decisions to attempt or defer breeding in a globally distributed migratory species, the greater white-fronted goose. With this information, we can prioritize conservation investments where and when for maximum effectiveness in the face of global changes. So I mentioned we have some fairly small sample sizes that I presented in this analysis. We've continued to deploy these exact units on mid-continent birds. We've continued to deploy these on Greenland birds. In the next several years, I anticipate we'll have several hundred units from each population with multiple years of data. So we'll be able to estimate these features of movement and behavior in a much greater way in the coming years, which is quite exciting. So to close this talk, I just wanted to briefly talk about the future of bird research through the lens of movement ecology. So of course, we're seeing in the press and in the scientific literature some amazing strategies that are being uncovered by these novel tracking technologies. So for example, this recent story that probably lots of you saw regarding bar-tailed godwits breaking the record for nonstop bird flight between Alaska and New Zealand. So I've classified our potential advancements here into two categories. One is just technologically speaking for a second. We now have more efficient units, for example, those with rechargeable batteries. We can collect more frequent data with these more efficient units, and these units now have auxiliary sensors, like, for example, the acceleration sensors. We also are quickly advancing the processing and statistical capacity here. So we have, of course, more efficient processors. The field of bioinformatics is exploding from a human health perspective, but also in ecology. We have the rapid development of statistical models, and more folks are sharing code and ways of approaching mathematical thinking, and this all allows reproducibility and greater accessibility, I think, to practitioners, which is really exciting. So I anticipate that the work that we're doing on Greenland white-fronted geese and mid-continent white-fronted geese will translate into work on much smaller species in the years ahead. We're already using these technologies for smaller bodied waterfowl like ducks and smaller bodied birds like shorebirds. So we have separate work on black-bellied plover, Hudsonian godwits, and also American avocets. So these units are gaining in traction, and in the smaller size is allowing for this really cool additional insight. With that, I'd like to thank a series of folks for making this work possible, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mitch. That was a really great presentation. Really nice look at using, both a detailed kind of technological advance, as well as I really appreciated your broad generalizations about the future and the hopeful application of these devices and their outputs for really understanding how and why birds make decisions and where we can target our conservation. So, great presentation. Anna, do we have time for a couple questions?
Yeah, there are actually no questions in the Q&A yet, but some will probably come in. But I have a question for you. I think it was really cool that you looked at temporal variation, like both in the behavioral responses and the environmental variables that you were seeing if they had an effect. And I'm wondering, why do you think the precipitation rate sometimes had a positive and sometimes had a negative effect on feeding rate, and like why the direction of the effect switched back and forth so often for the individual birds? Yeah.
So of course, when dealing with weather data, it can be quite broad. And so these microclimate effects really are what are influencing decisions to go feed in that day, or go to stationary behaviors from feeding, say. So I think the interval at which these birds are making decisions is really spatially variable. I'm not sure that we can capture the exact moments that those birds are making those decisions based on our particular precipitation data. So I think overall, there would be, if we could capture, like, for example, precipitation sensors on the birds themselves, we might have a more unified effect of positive or negative. I think that overall, these birds are quite robust. They're used to living in really harsh conditions. And so I'm not convinced that normal precipitation would hugely influence their behavior. I think you have to have repeated really big rain, snow, ice, wind events for these birds to uniformly behave in a particular way. And so I think that's why we're just seeing lots of variation, like how a lot of us might respond to rain, which is an everyday event.
Great,
Cool,
thanks.
thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more, Tom?
Do you have one?
There's a question from Brant. Have you considered collecting movement data across the annual cycle for juveniles to understand what might be limiting patterns of age-specific survival, given that recruitment is the demographic mechanism driving population decline?
Yes, definitely. I would absolutely love to mark the juveniles. So far, we're just trying to up the sample size of this one unique cohort, the adult females, to understand productivity. But with more and more capacity for devices come these additional sort of wish list items. And the next wish list item would be that one, to understand what's going on with juveniles. Why aren't they making it? We're looking at it through a very narrow lens, what's happening in Greenland or the Canadian Arctic without actually being there. So to be able to fit other cohorts with these tracking devices seems really cool.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you.
For our next talk, so we took a really broad look over the top of the continent. We sort of did some detailed technology stuff. We took a deep dive into mathematics with the work that Wayne presented, and now with our next talk presented by Adam Smith, we're going to take a look at the foundation for and of course for Brandon Edwards as well. They're going to share in this presentation. Adam will tell you that Brandon's done a lot of most of the heavy lifting on this work. But in any event, we're going to take a look at this foundation for how we even began to make inferences about population size and trends, and talk about improvements in that realm. So Adam is a senior biostatistician with the Canadian Wildlife Service, which we all know now is a branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And Brandon is a graduate student at Carleton University in Ottawa. So they'll co-present in talking about a strategy for integrating observational monitoring data and predictive modeling of population change. Take it away.
Super. Thanks so much, Tom. And thanks to the organizers for inviting us to talk about this. This is, I think, a really exciting time in monitoring bird populations and reporting on the status of bird populations, and we're excited, I think, about what's possible here. The stuff we're going to talk about, I think Brandon and I are going to talk about here, is largely focused on land birds. I think waterfowl, the kinds of things we're thinking about doing for land birds here have been essentially done for waterfowl for decades now, thinking about water bodies on the prairies and correcting for detectability in waterfowl surveys, et cetera. But yeah. And to start off with, I want to say also that the vast majority of this is not us, not just us. There's all kinds of people whose ideas we are contributing to this, and whose ideas we are stealing, for lack of a better word, working with. There's so many giants and shoulders to stand on here. The NA POPs column on the left there, we'll talk about that a bit. I'll explain what that is. And really what we're talking about here is that for the last 40 years, we, and when I say we, I mean the conservation community and the agency biologists and statisticians in the Canadian Wildlife Service and the USGS, et cetera, and state and province level, we've been estimating trends from our monitoring data for 40 years or more. And we've learned a lot, just a tremendous amount in that period of time. But we've largely been thinking about trends in relative abundance. And then over that same time period, there's been some absolutely incredible work done by the folks involved in the Partners in Flight group. So Blanchard and Wayne Thogmartin and Ken Rosenberg and everyone working on those PIF population estimates to estimate the number of birds that are in the continent or regions of the continent, the actual sort of population size. And more recently, there's been lots of really neat work going on in Alberta and in Canada, the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, generating almost national scale density estimates for many species of birds. I'm going to come back to that as well. Some really neat work going on there. And so we have these estimates of population size, and we have these estimates of relative abundance and change or trend in change in relative abundance. And then this 3 billion birds paper that came out last year was one of the first attempts to take those two sources of information and combine them in a sort of structured modeling approach to say, well, with those two kinds of information, we should be able to calculate the number of birds that were in the continent every year for the last 50-ish years. And that analysis taught us a lot about how bird populations have changed over the last 40 or 50 years. And it taught us a lot about how compelling that kind of population size and the change in the number of birds is to the public, to decision makers. Putting a number on it had absolutely just staggering communication potential, a really compelling number. And on top of that, we're also at a point where the North American Breeding Bird Survey has just undergone a sort of reimagining or a strategic plan to map out the next 5 to 10 years for the BBS, and to think of some of the ways to evolve to meet the changing conservation needs of the bird conservation community. And there's some really neat things in this report. It came out in the summer. There's some really neat forward-looking strategies in this that involve releasing the point level bird and spatial information for each one of those 50 stops on every route in the BBS, improving access to the analysis methods and tools, the results themselves, but also filling the gaps. The BBS is a roadside survey, and that's brilliant. So the colors on the map here that you're looking at are just a coarse estimate of the proportion of the landscape that is within 400 meters of a secondary road. So in theory, on some level, available to be sampled by a BBS survey. And so in the north or the central and eastern portion of the continent, in those dark blue areas, we're talking about more than 80% of the landscape being within that 400 meters. The BBS, a roadside survey, does a brilliant job of sampling the landscape. And then, of course, in other parts of the landscape, there are gaps. And so there are gaps in the sort of roadside or off-road alpine areas, for example, in the west. And there are the obvious gaps in the north and in the south. And in the north, of course, there simply aren't roads. In the south, a BBS style survey has been attempted in Mexico, and for practical reasons, it just wasn't sufficient. And so there are some gaps, and the BBS strategic plan includes plans to fill in some of these gaps. And in a nutshell, I think the approach to filling those gaps is a function of cooperating and collaborating with existing surveys that are ongoing in some of those other areas that are not roadside BBS-based surveys, designing new surveys that designing new surveys to fill the remaining gaps, and integrating information. That idea of filling those gaps with those existing programs on paper sounds wonderful, very efficient. If someone's doing monitoring there, well, let's kind of integrate all of these things. But of course, that's not simple, because each one of these other programs has a unique sampling design and unique sampling frame, but also unique field methods. And so the amount of time that someone spends in the field, the distance covered, the distance sampled from a point count perspective varies quite a bit across all these different programs. And we need some way to coherently and numerically integrate information across those programs. And so one of the things that we're working on is a way to do that. This NAPOPS program, essentially the goal is to allow us to take all of these counts from each one of these different programs and transform them into estimates of true density. So at this point, I'll hand it off to Brandon.
Yeah, for sure. So at this point, the question sort of becomes like, how do we actually get the density? So we can start to think about the processes involved in getting a count of abundance during any given survey. So it turns out that it's necessarily the case that what we record during a survey is just a subset of the true density at that site. So for example, you could think, for example, there could be 5, say, bay-breasted warblers occupying a site that we're surveying, but maybe we only survey for 3 minutes, and during those 3 minutes, only 2 bay-breasted warblers sing. So we only end up recording 2 of those warblers. Or perhaps a third one was in fact singing, but from very far away, and we just couldn't hear it. So all of these factors that account for the detectability of birds can sort of be thrown into this latent detectability function or a detectability offset. So really, when we're surveying, we get a count. We really want the density, but the only way we can get that density is by figuring out how the heck we can get this detectability offset. And luckily for us, there already exists some of the statistical tools to actually estimate these detectability functions. And one such detectability offset is this QPAD offset that was developed by Peter Solomos and company in their 2013 papers. So essentially how this offset works is for each species in a given survey, this offset combines an estimate of the probability that a bird sings, or at least gives some sort of cue that it's there, and we'll call this the bird's availability P, it combines it with the probability that that Q is actually detected by the observer. So we'll call that the perceptibility Q, plus information about the site's area. And so area is easy enough to sort of calculate. It's your friend and mine, pi r squared, but trying to find an estimate of P and Q is what takes some thinking. So we could consider modeling values of P and Q by combinations of one or more covariate. You can move to the next slide for this. And yeah, so we might consider modeling the values of P and Q by combinations of one or more covariates that we might think of, and then conditioning that on the actual type of survey being conducted. So for P, so the bird's availability, we might consider modeling P by a function of the time of the day that we're conducting a survey and or the time of the year that we're conducting the survey, both of which could very well play a part in the probability that the bird makes itself available. And then we would condition that on the information regarding the duration of the survey. So like Adam was sort of alluding to earlier, you would probably assume that a longer survey would mean that a higher probability of a bird being available for someone to detect during that survey. Similarly for Q, which is the probability that the bird's actually perceived by an observer, this is where we can begin to consider environmental biases that might affect an observer's ability. So for example, in surveying by a road, the roadside survey may bias someone's ability to actually perceive the bird due to something like road noise, especially if you're surveying by a particularly busy road, compared to a survey that maybe takes place off-road. And then in a similar vein, surveying in a dense closed canopy forest may bias someone's ability to perceive a bird, maybe through muffling the forest, muffling the bird's sound, compared to a survey that takes place in, say, an open grassland. So we could model Q, the perceptibility, by these environmental covariates, so roadside status and forest cover, and then condition that on information regarding the distance that the survey is being considering, because you would imagine that if a bird is further away, if our survey is sort of accounting for a larger distance, birds further away may just be more difficult to perceive anyway. So can you go to the next slide? And now we actually have a method of calculating this sort of mysterious detectability function or offset, which means that now we actually have a way of calculating true density at a given survey site. So with the QPAD estimate, the detectability offset is just given by the product of the availability and the perceptibility and the area. And so we can sub that into our original equation there. And the best part of this is the fact that this detectability offset accounts for the survey type. So if we had a count from one survey protocol, so I don't know, pick your favorite bird survey in North America, we can combine information about availability and perceptibility with info on that survey protocol to generate an estimate of density for that survey. And then that estimate of density would effectively be speaking the same language as an estimate of density produced by another survey protocol that might take into account different length of time for surveying, different distance. So the key here is, as long as we have the covariates available, and as long as we have information about the survey protocol, we can estimate the density. So that's pretty useful. And clearly, if we want to go to the next slide here, these detectability offsets are sort of the glue that we need to be able to integrate these different survey protocols. So why not attempt to generate offsets for as many North American land bird species as possible? And indeed, that's the goal of this NA POPs program that Adam was talking about. So we want to create an open, and in fact, we are creating an open access database of these offsets by considering counts from as many different surveying conditions as possible for as many different species as possible in North America. So currently, NA POPs represents a growing partnership of data providers across North America who are providing data to us to calculate these offsets. And just quickly by the numbers, NA POPs is currently generating offsets by considering over over 5 million observations across 213 different projects, which have been able to so far provide sufficient data for over 250 North American species, which is pretty great so far. So next slide. I mentioned those covariates earlier in order to calculate values of P and Q. And this, for now, these are actually the covariates that we are using for NA pops. So to calculate P, we're going to consider the time of day and time of year. And to calculate the perceptibility, we're very interested in those roadside biases and forest cover biases. Now, with that being said, this is very much an ongoing living project with room for future improvements. So, you know, as the research sort of progresses, we could very well start considering different combinations of covariates and more sophisticated models to actually calculate P and Q. And then finally, when thinking about the spatial coverage of NA pops so far, there are many places that NA pops is covering well, and that's sort of given by those darker shaded areas on this map. But there are also many areas where there are gaps. And I've highlighted some bolded regions on this map where we either are expecting data that we have coming in soon, or such as the case of Mexico, regions that we hope to expand into with this program. And in particular, we know of the Paralis program that is doing excellent work in that region. And it's a program that we hope to reach out to soon. And, you know, if anybody in this audience has data for any of these really light colored regions, we would love to hear from you if you'd be interested in contributing. So we have sort of a skeleton website at the moment that we're working on building a little bit better, but definitely reach out to us if you're interested in contributing to this project. So pass it back to Adam.
Super, thanks, Brandon. Yeah, and so I'll try and go through this fairly quickly, the rest of this, but just to give you a sense of some of the potential benefits from this kind of approach and deriving from NA pops immediately. This paper, again, Peter Salamos et al., some of the boreal avian modeling group, gives an example of some comparison between the PIF population size estimates and estimates derived from the kind of process that we're imagining here. And this graph, I won't go into the details, but you know, in essence, the color of the points, these species specific points, the color of these points relate to the sort of putative over or underestimate of the population size based on a comparison between the PIF approach and another approach, this approach that relies on these QPAD style estimates. And essentially the roadside bias and habitat bias explains a lot of the difference in those two effects. So you know, in the short term, we're thinking better estimates of population size. It allows us to integrate across all of these different programs. So more data, more locations on the ground across the continent. It also allows us even to include things like audio recording. So automated recording units that are huge in terms of sampling some of the northern gaps in the continent. And then also, because we're integrating all of these things and using estimates of density, it effectively allows us to turn our status and trend modeling every year, our annual reporting process, into a process that simultaneously estimates trends and population size. The range of potential spatial and temporal covariates that we can integrate into this, of course, is just tremendous. And this little timeline at the bottom here is just to remind me to mention the fact that because we're using offsets to account for detectability, in theory, if we're making certain assumptions about the consistency of that detectability process through time, we could back correct historical data from, for example, the BBS. There are all kinds of examples of using covariates and integrating data sets to understand the causes, the causal modeling to understand changes in populations. There are lots of different examples out there. Particularly relevant, I think, is some of the incredible work that's going on at Cornell with the eBird crowd. Really neat stuff. And so really all we're talking about here is is a sort of point in time where all of the pieces kind of come together. We have monitoring data from so many different programs across the continent. We have our understanding of the changes in relative abundance and how to estimate trends and changes over time. We have numerical tools now that allow us to integrate all of this information across these programs, spatial covariates, and the capacity to estimate density, true density, to estimate true density. We have the computational tools, the supercomputers required to manage and use all of these different data sources, these massive data sets that we're talking about. And so we're at a point where as an agency, we're thinking, well, we could be doing this on an annual basis. We could be reproducing essentially the 3 billion birds analysis every year. And on top of that, we could be doing it at a spatial, at multiple spatial scales, multiple temporal scales every year, so that we could drill down into the spatial patterns in population change. And on top of that, when we're talking about integrating covariates, we're really moving from a reporting framework where we're tracking populations through time and reporting on how things have changed over time, and into a true prediction framework where we're talking about here are the causal mechanisms underlying some of these changes in population, the when populations change question, the where they've changed on the landscape, how those patterns occur, and getting a much deeper understanding of what's driving changes in land bird populations across the continent. I should also mention as well that we're working towards ensuring that all of this is done in an open science framework, which is a theme that I've heard lots. We've heard lots this week, but making sure that the data, the code, the models that we're using, all of this is done in a transparent framework because, well, number one, of course, we're not doing this all alone. This is a very ambitious set of goals that we're aiming at here, and there already is so much work going on. You know, we're borrowing ideas from others, and we hope that to work in a transparent framework so that others can borrow ideas from us, and that we expose ourselves to the kind of criticism that makes everything better. And so with that, I just want to say thank you very much again to everyone for the organizers and for listening, and all to the people whose ideas we're working with.
Well, thanks, Adam and Brandon. Let's have an opportunity for a couple questions about your presentation, and then before moving into a panel framework. So, Anna, do we have anything coming from the Q&A?
Yes, we do. That was a really cool presentation, and it's awesome to see you incorporating data from all these different protocols, especially ProALICE. I love that you're doing that. So this is a question kind of related to that, since you're trying to work with data across this whole latitudinal gradient. So someone is asking, is species richness and abundance at each site, especially species richness, I think, being accounted for in Q, since it gets increasingly difficult to accurately identify bird species and number of birds when there's a high number of species and many birds singing?
That's a great question. Brandon, do you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, I mean, like my initial response would be no, that's not being accounted for. But that's a very good point. So I think that would be something important that we might want to account for in the future. I don't know if there was anything that you could add on to that, Adam.
No, that's exactly what I would have said. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Let's try and do that, because I think you're probably right. And someday we'll get there, I'm sure, or maybe someone else will, and they'll tell us about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's another question. Can you account for variation in density at scales that could inform management at scales of something like 10,000 acres?
So I think this is one of the really neat things about incorporating this into an annual sort of status reporting framework, is that we can continually improve these sorts of things. Also, by integrating across all these different data sets, you know, one of the things that the BBS has outlined in their strategic plan is to release the point level information, and so we can get these fine scale, this fine scale information. eBird is collecting stationary points, this fine scale information about the location of the bird observations. If we overlay that with covariates, then, you know, in a nutshell, yes, absolutely. So we can move to a point where we can inform not just the broad continental or national or provincial patterns, but also the fine scale, fine grained, you know, where things are changing and how those relate to different factors that are changing on the landscape.
Do we have time for one more, Tom?
Sure, take one more and then
Okay.
we'll bring everybody together.
Okay. This is an interesting one. A lot of recent state breeding bird atlases, beginning with Pennsylvania's second BBA to my knowledge, have included species-specific spatial density modeling based on point count data. These models have in turn been used to estimate state-level avian population numbers. Has there been an effort to compile and compare these state-specific estimates to the PIF BBS-derived estimates? And he says Virginia is queuing up to conduct these state-level analyses.
Yeah, great question. And so, and some of those atlases are near the top of our list. The NAPOPS program, we've really only just gotten going this summer, and it's been a weird time of life in, you know, this summer 2020. And so those state level atlases like Pennsylvania and others are high on our list of data sources to hopefully integrate into this effort. And in terms of that comparison of those state level density estimates with the broader level density estimates, I'm sure people have done those kinds of comparisons. I know a few years ago we did one in-house, and no big surprise found out that the state level high resolution values were probably more reasonable and better, but I don't know if anyone's done any broader comparison across those different sources, different estimates.
Okay, thanks, Adam and Brandon. At this time, I'd encourage everybody who spoke this morning and the Road to Recovery team to turn on your videos, and we'll go into sort of a free-ranging question and answer period. I mean, I think this was an incredible set of talks this morning. Very, very exciting and very hopeful in terms of our ability to at least provide the science to make really important changes in the future with bird conservation. It's sad, of course, that we're prompted to do this by the disturbing news of the loss of 3 billion birds, but encouraging, and to think that, you know, these tools will give us some power to really make a difference and change those trajectories to more positive ones. So thanks to all of you for doing this incredible research. And in keeping with today's theme of integrating data and operating with imperfect information, although it seems to be getting more and more toward the perfect side, operating with imperfect information, I'd like you all to think about ways in which you can, where do you see the power of your own technologies and methodologies increasing the power of the other speakers' technologies and methodologies? And I'm thinking of things like, well, like, what about weighing? What if we used a network analysis for every NextRad radar station and looked at the passing of birds from one station to another and things like that? So I'll let you ask questions of the other panelists or make comments to the other panelists for starters.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that I think you know, the scope of the sort of possible approaches that have been talked about over the last couple of days is really just fascinating, and all of these kind of parallel complementary approaches, I think really are going to feed into a much deeper understanding of how the how the natural world, how wildlife populations are changing through time. I think, for example, some of the, you know, the kind of brute force machine learning, big model, big data approaches that Brandon and I are scheming about are approaches that would allow us to take some of the fine-grained intense information from species-specific integrated population models, et cetera, and apply a sort of a practical test of how well the wood, for example, the wood thrush information, how well that might apply across many different eastern forest species. And so we were getting a coarser level of information with that sort of modeling approach than we would from an IPM, but we're getting it from many different species, and we're getting it at multiple spatial and temporal scales. And so those two pieces can, I think, really, there's lots of neat back and forth and informing and complementary aspects of that. And some of the stuff Adrian's doing gets the even bigger picture, which is just so exciting.
Yeah, I think like data integration is like methodologically, it's like a really important research avenue, and there's so much to be done there, because the reality is, of course, that none of our techniques or any of these approaches, none is perfect, and I really believe that in the cross comparison between different techniques, for example, like these new demographic methods that I've been talking about, just comparing those to like existing estimates that we have, for example, from maps, that really builds confidence, in that maybe these metrics are meaningful, and also tells you something about, okay, how spatially generalizable are these estimates that we get from maps. So it works always both ways. By showing that things start to line up, you build confidence in both, because for the ground truth we never really have in these issues. Also, like in for example, the combination of radar and eBird, I think, is promising, and we're sort of trying to think now also of ways using these sort of radar measurements, how sort of fluxes of birds are moving over the landscape, and inferring from them not only what happens in the sky, but also how to translate these patterns into what actually moves on the ground. And that really gives also an opportunity to link eventually to eBird data, where, of course, from the eBird data, we don't really get, if you look from one day to the next, you don't know, is it now mostly the detectability changes because it got, for example, much more windy, and therefore we detect less birds, or have birds actually left? And the radar actually gives you this really fine scale information of day-to-day days where there's huge passage, and I think looking into the future to combining these two can really strengthen the inference of both. But it's a very complex problem also, and but yeah, so lots of work to do.
So we could take questions from participants or from any of the other panelists, including Ken and Brant and Pete. I mean, one thing.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, if any panelists have questions, let's go with those, because there aren't really broad questions yet from the audience. But if you have them, feel free to type them in.
I'll ask a quick question for Adam and Brandon. I guess I'm just wondering, what's the time frame for completion of the NAPOPS effort? And the assumption is that data would then go back into to revise or update the PIF ACAD database at some point in time, I assume.
Yeah, right. And so we're working on at least a publication of the initial database of the estimates, the process, the modeling that we're using to estimate them. Within a year, we hope to have that publication out. But in terms of the, at what level do we start to integrate those back into, whether it's PIF population estimates or some evolved, some other kind of population estimate, that's still a bit of an open question. Yeah, I mean, we have little side projects already going, scheming about, well, if we did this, we could do that, and et cetera, et cetera. But working that up at scale will be a non-trivial process. We may spend a lot of time just waiting for things to process.
One of the things that struck me about all the talks was, especially the radar talk, is, and we've alluded to this in previous conversations over the past 3 days. There is a tremendous amount of information out there that has is potentially of utility in understanding bird populations, understanding population limitation, which is untapped. So the radar information has been there for years. It has only recently been applied to this exercise of trying to do conservation with it, which is amazing. And similarly, I think all that information about birds' behavior and the individual choices they make, and I'm thinking of the sort of overlap between what Mitch described and what we've done as just simply observers of birds for a long time. At the study of Swainson's thrushes and gray-cheeked thrushes on the coast of northern South America, where we're watching them, and we're watching them feed on various plants and what their weight gain is and how that translates into their migratory distance. Same sort of thing, one being inferred from new technological devices, and one using that age-old classic method of just simply careful observation of birds. And so it's really wonderful to see the ingenuity of the individual natural historian and the sort of the ingenuity of, oh, what if we use this device sort of being applied to the same problems? And it's just very exciting to see that happening.
We have a good question for all the panelists from Sarah Kendrick, which again is kind of segueing into the afternoon panel. So how do each of the panelists see their broad scale analyses being stepped down to inform land management or protection? What are the necessary next steps, if not yet taken, to inform conservation?
I'll build on that a little bit, but I'll point to Wayne to answer, because I thought one of Wayne's points, many of Wayne's points were really incredible, but one of which was the citation of the Nichols and Hines 2002 paper, where they really point to this idea of, which management actions can we really do and which are most sensitive to population growth rate. And that is such an important point that we really haven't touched upon in the first workshop or the second workshop, but we need to really emphasize. And so, Wayne, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that notion, because, we could identify limiting factors till we're blue in the face, but if we can't do anything about them, we're up creek, right? And so it's such an important point. I would love to hear you elaborate on that in the context of Sarah's question.
Yeah, I didn't get to read it, so I may not have fully digested her question, but yeah, there are a number of speakers this week have mentioned that there are various environmental factors associated with the vital rates and population rates of change that they're studying that aren't within our ability to manage. I mean, precipitation and atmospheric warming are really not within our ability to manage. And so we have to mitigate the consequences of that, and we have to think about how best to approach that mitigation. And so I guess when I look at the network approaches that I've been thinking about, I very briefly ended with habitat management in a wintering location, as well as habitat management in a breeding location. And we can imagine under, say, sea level rise, that habitat management in the wintering location is going to be difficult. And so we'd have to turn on the tap like Adrian's work suggests, and perhaps overcome that loss of the wintering locations by increasing the breeding habitat. And so, I think to some extent, it really requires a whole system perspective about how to approach these species. Through the week, we've talked about various limitations, but those limitations may not be within our ability to address. And so we may have to offset those limitations elsewhere across the species range and across the, not necessarily entirely within the area or location where those things are felt most, but in other areas. And so I think these larger scale perspectives about how species range over space and time are absolutely critical, because we don't necessarily have it within our wheelhouse in the areas where we see the problem greatest. So.
If I
It
could just,
also allows us to think
sorry.
about our consequences at a scale that we need to really have an impact at a large enough scale.
Yeah, I guess I would say that, you know, the waterfowl are a great example of how large scale government funding can turn a, you know, species around or conserve species. I mean, we have huge amounts of money flowing in for waterfowl and wetland conservation in North America. We don't have similar amounts devoted to grassland and forest conservation for grassland birds and forest birds. And so how do we get that? How do we get that? I don't know. Somehow we need to convince the Department of Agriculture that they're not just farming for corn and soybeans, but they're also farming grassland birds. And if we can convince them that the Conservation Reserve Program is an equally valuable thing as corn yields, then perhaps we have a mechanism to deliver the conservation at the scale that we need it to turn these species around.
Mitch, you look like you were coming in with a comment. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I was just going to add that it seems like to make really compelling cases about learning more about the annual cycle, we need to really identify which data types are required and the benefit of those data types. So providing some existing lines of evidence for how some investments in waterfowl, for example, spatially have impacted those populations, of course, is tangible. It's not as obvious how to translate it into what you were just saying, Wayne, which is I was going to say, which is the commodity of a grassland bird is just not, you know, it's a totally different game. And yet that's what needs to be done. And so thinking of ways in which we can incentivize grassland birds, forest birds with a necessary collection of data types, setting up the necessity really seems to be a potentially profitable way forward. But knowing which data types provide the best value added is in itself, I think, quite a challenge given the complexities of the ecology of these different species.
Commenting on one of your comments, Wayne, I mean, though, to a certain extent, I think this has to do with mitigating climate change, but it's also interesting to think that even though there's no control over precipitation per se, that I have seen in recent weeks some really compelling responses. I'm thinking of the Baird sparrow response and coming from the Central Grasslands Workshop, where though you can't control precipitation, there is some control over how the surface of the land receives that precipitation. And there were some remarkable examples of how ranchers who were managing their lands in an environmentally responsible way had a radically different response in terms of vegetation to whatever rainfall was available. And that was clearly of a benefit to birds. So I think thinking outside the box, that's a small scale. And so we still have the question of how do we scale that up to have a really the capacity for even something close to a range-wide response. But I think thinking outside the box, working with current land use in an imaginative way is really was a great example in that grassland summit. Well, we're at the top of the hour. And so I really want to thank everybody, not just this morning's contributors, but everyone who's contributed to the way in which the information and knowledge and wisdom has accumulated over the course of the last 3 days has been remarkable. And I want to remind everyone that we, except for my little mistake this morning where I missed part of Adrian's talk, but I'm going to contact Adrian and get him to do a special one-on-one repeat of the beginning of his talk. We are recording all these sessions. They are available on the website, and the website is listed at the bottom of the slide, so you can see the http://marilab R2R part 2/ On the website, if you scroll down to the agenda, the preliminary agenda, you'll see the links for the conversations that we've already recorded on the website there, and you have free access to those, and you can re-listen to any of the talks that you want, or the entire session. So again, thanks to everyone. I'm going to leave we're going to open the chat now, and we'll leave that open for some 20 minutes or so for people to make comments or add any other links that they find appropriate to the record for these workshops. And again, thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you in 50 minutes for the concluding session. And I think this will be as Anna alluded, a segue into the afternoon is to think about in a broader way how our conservation science, our bird conservation science, can be used in conjunction with other initiatives and other perspectives to bring back 3 billion birds. So we look forward to your attendance at the ultimate session of this workshop. So thanks again for your attention.